right, welcome to the podcast, guys. Shout out to Seb, who is currently in Bolivia, La Paz. And it was always a long shot to book in a podcast recording with someone on the road. And such has proved to be the case. So his trip down the infamous Death Road or whatever it's called into La Paz in Bolivia has delayed him. So he's not able to join today. But shout out to Seb Walker. He'll be joining in the weeks to come and is, as a teaser, it's just a brilliant example of someone that used to work within the fiat beast in a bank, on a trading floor, and is an absolute professional when it comes to allocating capital, and is now insanely bullish on Bitcoin, and had an interesting take on why he's buying Bitcoin in self-custody rather than MicroStrategy stock, which is what I wanted to really dig into with him today. But alas, that will have to wait for a couple of weeks. And to then riff off, what I was talking about in the last episode, the old me would have been freaking out right now. 20 minutes before the podcast is supposed to be recorded and the guest hasn't been able to make it. And I'm like, oh my God, I've got to post this. I've got to do that. And you're like, it's not a fun process. And so to really home in on what I like doing, it's like, what's interesting? Okay, well, I'm going to share what's interesting. So thank you so much for joining me on this journey. And let's dive into today. So I did a little 10-minute meditation. I call it the Power 10. And it's so helpful to see what kind of crops up and what can you tune into and listen, and what resonates, and what do you want to take you forwards or guide you forwards. And so 3 things have come up with today I will share. So number 1, net wealth. What is that? What does that actually mean? Shout out to Jin, who is now 2 episodes ago, who came on the show, and she was very honest. She's like, Jake, the thing about talking with you is that I feel very comfortable talking about finances, and you mentioned words that I don't understand, but I wouldn't mind asking you. And that was a really awesome endorsement from her as to my manner and approach to this conversation. And I hope that comes because of the fact I once knew nothing. I was thrown into this situation where I had inheritance to figure out. You're 20 years old, your father's died, you get given some money. It's like, well, do not fuck this up. And the truth is I did a number of times. So where's this going? Well, Jin made the point. She's like, for example, Jake, what is net wealth? What does that mean? And it's fair enough to say that when you get closer and closer to a subject, closer and closer to a problem, you can sometimes get caught in the weeds, and you miss the forest for the tree, as they say. And so let me just run you through how I now think about this. Wealth is a kind of catch-all term to summarize where you're at in terms of your current capital. Capital, I then split into 3 main tranches, as you've heard me talk about, which is the financial capital at your disposal, the human capital or humanistic, and then the intellectual. Now, of course, financial capital is much easier to measure because we have money in which to do so. So money ultimately is a technology that solves the double coincidence of wants problem. Money is the other half of every trade you ever make, for services, for products, or you selling your own time, etc. It's in receipt of money, or you give money to receive something. And therefore, we can use price. And so whatever money you might be using, whether that's Aussie dollars or British pounds or euros or gold or silver or bronze or glass beads, or, you will have heard stories of people trying to buy someone's sister or wife, perhaps on a trip from the UK to Africa, for some sheep. I mean, it's money is everywhere and everything, but some things are much better at being money than others. And Bitcoin, in my opinion, is the latest iteration of a long-held problem that humans had, which is the double coincidence of wants problem. In a barter economy, how do you swap 6 oranges for 1 apple? It's very hard. Well, money solves that problem. And so money is a way to price things and ultimately value. So the language of value. How do I value something? And this is where you end up diving down into, or I ended up diving down into, the Austrian School of Economics, which is a field of economics that's not widely taught. The closer you get to it, the more obvious it becomes as to why, in that it is a proponent of free market philosophy, proponent of libertarianism, and it does a very good job of explaining why government intervention is a net negative. And so, unsurprisingly, the governments of today, in cahoots with the money printer and the monetary scientists and the policy scientists working together, they like intervention, right? And then they can pay for it on the back end with the money they print. And so the Austrian School of Economics is this whole other world in which you could operate economically. And that's where the phrase sound money comes from. So before I digress too much into like what is money and the history of money and the Austrian School of Economics, what is wealth? Well, in a lot of cases, your wealth is really your time. How much time do you have to yourself? And when I think about my day, like I've got to the point now where I feel very wealthy in that I'm not having to exchange most of my hours for a fiat employment contract. And the day that I really got my head around the fact that that was actually possible was probably one of the wealthiest I'll ever feel. It's like, oh, wow, I control my own time. I'm not having to rush to a place of work to get paid 340 days a year. I actually now have the time and space to take a step back to focus on my marriage, focus on being a father, and focus on my own health. And with that, it's interesting in the space that it created for me allowed actually my investing to improve hugely. Like the returns I have got since relinquishing this kind of, it's really hard. It's almost like an inherited trauma towards got to work, like a hamster. And when you come off the hamster wheel, you're like delirious. Like, what's going on? This doesn't feel right. I should be in an office right now. Where am I? This is wrong. I'm not allowed to do this. But with that extra space comes new ideas, comes additional creativity, and in my opinion, improved decision making. And improved decision making is basically investing. So you make bad decisions, you lose your money. You make good decisions, you make your money. And that is capitalism. And that is not a dirty word. Unlike what a lot of the mainstream kind of champagne socialists will have you believe, capitalism is a great thing, and it should be something that we really try to empower and unleash, and it, in my opinion, enables human flourishing. Again, not to go on too much of a tangent, but Jake, how do you calculate your net wealth? Well, okay. What the combination of your intellectual, human, and financial capital is your net wealth. Now, how do you actually calculate your intellectual skills? How do you actually calculate your humanistic capital? It's not altogether obvious, and they're more qualitative rather than quantitative responses. I've got 3 kids, they can do X amount of work, or I've got 10 cousins and they can do X amount of work, or I'm qualified in, whatever relationship you might have. And then the intellectual side of things is like, okay, well, per hour I can bill X because of my qualification, whatever, or I learned to build and scale companies, or I have a social media following, or whatever your area of expertise might be that generates income and generates capital growth. So those are harder to quantitatively measure. So the easiest thing that we do is we measure our financial assets. It's like, okay, well, if our total financial assets can be calculated using the money of the day, then let's do that. And so thanks to Jin and some coaching I got from her, I now every week put together a statement of assets that I share with my wife. And I'm looking at, okay, well, where are our investments today and what are they worth? And how much of that is in equities? How much of that is in cash? How much of that is in, Bitcoin is essentially cash. How much of that is in jewelry? Whatever you might own, people own lots of real estate, or they own classic cars, or they own artwork, or, you name it, right? There's, any number of things you can own, limited edition trainers, whatever you're interested in. What is the total of all the stuff you own? And that is your assets. But importantly, you then have to think about, what are my liabilities? So, okay, well, I've got this credit card debt, or I've got a lease on this car, or I've got a mortgage on this house that's worth whatever it might be. And so you then got to balance the books. This is the idea of a balance sheet, right? So, okay, well, what is all of it added up? And then you take your assets and liabilities, and what's the final figure? So, okay, well, on my statement of assets, every week I have a net wealth in Aussie dollar terms, but I also calculate it in British pounds, and I also calculate it in Bitcoin. And it's been fascinating recently watching it fluctuate, especially in Bitcoin denomination, because unlike what we're used to, which is basically up equals good in pound or dollar terms, Bitcoin is deflationary, so it's decreasing. It really screws with the head, this, because on a chart, you're normally looking for that up and to the right. but actually the future productivity growth in combination with the deflationary currency, good equals down and to the right. And I admit this is not something I've got my head around at all. So I'm going to do some more work on that. And that's what's fun about these solo rips. Okay, I have to go back and figure that out. So, okay, calculate up all of your assets. What do you think they're worth today? Now, some things are super liquid, like the dollars in your bank account. You could get those tomorrow, subject to not being frozen by the bank or something. But your house, it was last valued when you bought it 3 years ago. What do you think it's worth today? Okay, well, you might be able to calculate based on some local sales what you think it might be. And there's a really interesting bit of work that was done. If you go to look at the Nakamoto portfolio, shout out to the guys that built that, there's a very clear guide that like property prices are actually very volatile. But because of the illiquidity of them, they don't mark to market every day. So you're not buying and selling the same house every single day of the year. You buy and sell it maybe once every 5 years. And so the actual price paid can look more steady than the actual market is. And that's just due to the nature of the volume of transactions. It's just much, much smaller than people taking cash in and out of a bank, or equally people that trade the S&P index or whatever. Or, US Treasuries has traditionally been the risk-free return that an investor will look at as highly liquid. They're not going to go bankrupt, and you get paid an interest rate for giving them money as debt. You can get a pretty good understanding quite quickly. It's like, what am I actually worth today in dollar terms? Okay. Now, the next bit I think that's important and why your net wealth relates to your time is actually then you want to look at something, what I would describe as in startup language, at least your burn rate. But I don't really like that language because it's a not very nice connotation. So think of it more as like, I tried to rephrase it as like the fun rate. And that's basically like, what does your life cost? And that obviously varies. Certain times of year, like Christmas, more expensive, or all the insurance contracts get paid at whenever time of year for your home insurance, your car insurance, all these bills pop up. Suddenly it's all at once, like shit, okay, I need more money this month. But most people are pretty on top of their expenses and how much their life costs. And with that, you then want to think about, okay, what is my net wealth divided by my annual run rate? And so just to give a very simple example, let's say you're worth 1 million and your run rate each year, you spend 100 grand. And therefore you've got 10% each year that has been eaten into your funds. So your net assets at the end of year one, if they do not increase in value, are now 900K because you spent the 100 on life. And so how I think through this is every single week I'm looking at, okay, what are my net assets today? Obviously assets minus liabilities. And then roughly speaking, how does that match up versus the money that we spend? And obviously, the longer the runway you have, the better. So let's say your net assets were actually 10 million and your burn rate is only 100 grand. Now, these are random figures, but the 100K you spend a year, well, suddenly now you can live 10 times longer without actually going out and creating any income. It's that trade-off there that I think is the most important to measure, because obviously everyone's expenses are different, everyone's net wealth is different, you live in different parts of the world, you have different tax regimes, you might have kids, you might not have kids, you might be at a different stage of your life, and with that come different risk profiles. So I'm in my mid-30s, I've got 3 young children, I'm very much still in the wealth growth phase. Like, I'm looking to take more risk, I've got a lot of work time ahead of me, and I'm okay with that. Now, that's really cool. Whereas if in 30 years time I'm 60, mid-60s, and you're like, well, I'm starting to think more about like slowing down and how do I provide for myself without generating value into the future? And that's a very different risk profile. 2 people come to mind here, which I want to just shout out to. One is Larry Lepard, who came on my podcast in the past. And Larry's just an awesome guy to learn from. And I heard him once say on a pod, it's like, shit, if I was in my mid-30s, I'd just be loading up on this Bitcoin stuff. But I'm not. I'm in my mid-60s. I'm a gold guy, or I was a gold guy. And so, I've got lots of friends that want to take a bit less risk than that. And shout out to Larry for so many of the lessons he's taught me and the content I've consumed of his. And the other here is then, okay, if you're thinking about your burn rate, your net wealth, okay, how long can I last for? It really comes back to this whole idea of time. And the more time you can buy yourself, the more space you have for new ideas to drop in, for new creativity to occur. And I think that's where really one can start to move the needle on one's happiness. Because with that extra space, the financial capital buys you the ability to reinvest into your human capital and into your intellectual capital. And you want to constantly be trying to balance those three buckets. So, another common thing that we come across is this idea of unhappy billionaires. Well, money solves money problems, but it doesn't make you a good parent. It doesn't make you a supportive spouse. It doesn't make you a good friend. You have to work on those things. And if anything, sometimes people have the opposite experience. It's like, why is that? Well, to me, that's a poor allocation of capital. And so it's actually not about being, the richest person in the world. It's not about being the most intellectual person in the world. It's about having a happy balance, which then gives you the space to enjoy your life. And that's ultimately what this is all about. So that's hopefully a good insight on like what is wealth. Well, wealth is really a combination of those three buckets, and ultimately can be compounded down to time and how much you can control your own time. Okay, and that's that on wealth. I think I've yarned enough on that. So the next thing I wanted to talk through is a subject I'm not an expert in. I'll caveat this whole phase with that, but it's something it's really become very prominent in recent discussions, and that is around tariffs. The incoming President Trump has announced a bunch of tariffs with Mexico and Canada and China. I was like, what does this mean? Now, I am a paying subscriber to Anthony Pompliano's newsletter. Shout out to Pomp. I've never met him or run a podcast with him, but I'd love to one day. And his story is great, and his content is just how he gets that volume. It's super impressive. I'd love to know how he does it, actually. That's a question I'll save for him from when one day we'll speak. The newsletter he posted this week about tariffs was really interesting, and I only got through the first 30%, but the message was very clear, which was basically everything he thought he knew about tariffs was wrong, and everything he thought he knew about tariffs was what the mainstream narrative was, and it was just extremely similar to his initial experiences of Bitcoin, which is basically all your initial hunches of Bitcoin are wrong. And you've got to start looking for yourself, go and do the research. What precedent actually existed in the history to make this a good idea or a bad idea? What worked, what didn't work? Go and find out for yourself. And I must, go and finish reading that article. But it brought to mind for me, because obviously as an investor, you're looking at macro situations and you're thinking, okay, well, what does this mean? And how can I potentially benefit from it? And how do I protect myself from any potential downside? And it's something that then brought up for me. I've recently come across a Nostr account, a guy called Peter Alexander. Peter seems super smart and has spent a lot of time in China. I don't know if he's actually based there full time still at the moment, but I want to get him on the podcast. So Peter, if you ever listen to this, please reach out, and I'm putting you on my guest hit list. But we were doing a bit of back and forth about what's going on in China at the moment. And again, to reference Austrian School of Economics, there's a term that they love, which is to do with time preference. It's funny how this word time's coming up a few times today. So in the US, a supposed republic, so a true representation of the people, governed for the people, by the people. At least that's the rhetoric. In practice, not quite true from what I'm seeing. And there's the 4-year election cycle. And it's true, Mr. Trump has got in with a landslide win in the most recent election, but give him 12 months and suddenly they're talking about the midterms. And because he's been president before, he can't get a second term. And maybe JD Vance is, going to come through the ranks and be the next guy. And I've seen a few people predict already that we're set for 12 years of Republican conservative rule in the US, and how good a thing that is in conjunction with some of the tech talent that's sitting underneath some of these leading politicians. It's like, okay, well, the people that are in the seat of power now are happy that they've won, and this is the rhetoric, and let's see what the proof in the pudding actually is. And so boom, suddenly, no strategic Bitcoin reserve as of this time of speaking, but trade war, boom. And it's like, what's going to happen? And so Peter has pointed out very, very well that the US government is making decisions with an extremely high time preference mentality, i.e., it's all about short-term gains. Whereas the leadership in China is taking a very, very low time preference approach, which is a much more kind of Bitcoin aligned approach. And there's a few things that I find interesting here that I've come across before. So yeah, first of all, shout out to Peter for these insights. It's so true that the headline grabbing stuff is, pro America and America first, and let's scrap in income tax and let's bring manufacturing back home and all this stuff. And that could well be the case. However, like, what does it mean when someone's operating in high time preference mentality? Well, what it means is they make very short-term decisions. What it means is they're not able to delay gratification. What it means is they're not making decisions from a place of sound capitalist thought. And that's pretty interesting. You think, what? Isn't America the leading capitalist country? Isn't China communist? Like, that doesn't make sense. How can China be making better economic decisions if they're not like supposedly quote unquote free? And so I guess it's this whole process. Suddenly you realize there is no right and there is no wrong, in the same sense that like you have to have hot and cold. Everything is a kind of gray area, and we'll have to wait and see like what actually happens. I love the idea of removing tax. It seems very obvious to me that modern government has, with the aid of a money printer, become this behemoth organization that is completely unaccountable to its actions. It spends way more than it earns. It's like an out of control, like billionaire 16-year-old that hasn't been properly coached in the ways of the world, and they're just going to spunk it up the wall by the time they're 25 and kill themselves with a drug addiction. It's funny, right? Like, how can that be the case? But it's very clear to me, and this is anecdotal, I know, but having spent 4.5 years living in Singapore, I was a shipbroker, middleman between shipping companies, ship traders, and the dry bulk market. So mainly iron ore, coal, grain, and we were shipping stuff in huge quantities up to, like, largely from Brazil, India, Australia, South Africa, into China, Korea, Japan. And so I did business trips to Hong Kong, to Seoul, and it was just such a fascinating experience. But having worked in Asia for a number of years, there was something that just caught my attention so crazily at the time. Singapore was a breath of fresh air for me in terms of the sense of exuberism and excitement and positivity and forward-thinking approach, versus at the time, it was the Greek debt crisis in the Eurozone, and just everything was just, and seemingly still is, Europe's just about functioning. I mean, amazing tourist industry, but like nothing new has really come out of Europe for so long. And now, I mean, it's interesting to see what's happening with the UK and Brexit and the backlash from that, and just more incompetence, and a Labour government in the UK that's just saddling businesses with more and more problems, and a net outflow of the wealthiest people in the UK, biggest in the world per capita, second only to China, which is obviously 1 billion people versus 66 million. It's wild what's happened in England, but then the European Union is almost worse, right, in terms of the government centralized approach and the intervention in markets that's just happening on a crazy scale. But I was in Singapore, and they'd built this new motorway from the airport into the center of town, and it was finished just as I was about to leave. I'll never forget driving through. It was 6 lanes, pristine. You couldn't even see the other side of the underground motorway because it was in a separate tunnel. And then halfway through, as you're basically traveling underneath Marina Bay, which largely was just water however many years before and is now reclaimed land with skyscrapers on, there was this huge hole about halfway down, and you could go on the city plans, and it was basically, that was the entrance to the next part of Singapore that they hadn't built. And these guys were planning with 30 years in advance. And that's not to say that Singapore is Chinese. It has a very strong Chinese background and influence, but equally very strong Indian, very strong Indonesian. It's this huge blend of cultures sitting at the bottom of Southeast Asia. It's a fascinating place to go and visit, and I highly recommend spending time there. But point being is, I noticed this in my mid-20s. I didn't understand it's called low time preference, but that's what it is. Like, I didn't see 6-lane underground highways being built in Europe with holes ready for the next city that was going to be built. Quite the opposite. And then you suddenly start to think, okay, well, hang on. What are these modern democratic structures that are being used to make decisions? And is it actually better to have, the most popular person voted in? And actually, hang on a second, each vote isn't actually the same in that certain jurisdictions have fewer people, but that jurisdiction represents one seat in the Senate or one seat in the Houses of Parliament, or however it might be broken down. And it's like, whoa, this is a mess, isn't it? All this goes to say, what's going to happen with tariffs? I don't know. Is it interesting as an investor? Absolutely. And could we see the golden age of America? As I see these kind of headlines being touted. Well, I definitely believe that if the government gets the hell out of the way and takes the handbrake off America as entrepreneurs, then watch out. That is the most creative place with the deepest capital markets that's ever existed. Being short America in that environment is probably not where you want to go. But then there's this fascinating thing, like I touched on the previous episode, with the game theory of nation states and adopting Bitcoin and the very cozy relationship between central banks and modern government. And the central bankers, they ain't giving up easily. They're not going to suddenly be like, oh yeah, sure, just please come ahead, use this other currency. And their business model's gone, basically. And that's why I love this phrase: Bitcoin obsoletes central banks. Let that sink in. Whoa. What does a world without a central bank look like? Now, 150 years ago, people knew exactly what it looked like. It looked like the gold standard. And I like this idea of the Gilded Age, which is late 1800s, early 1900s, where arguably the best quality of life was achieved in the history of man. And yes, we're told every day, oh, you're so lucky to be alive today. Life's better on all these different reasons. You've got all this stuff. But consumerism has overtaken quality, and they're different things. Thanks to the Bitcoin rabbit hole, I've been able to look into that and start studying it and thinking about, okay, hang on. What if we're actually going backwards? What if technological change is not increasing, but actually decreasing? What does that mean? And I'll leave you to think about that. Like, could it be the case that actually modern life 120 years ago was superior to today? Maybe. Fix the money, fix the world. It's a great saying. And I truly believe that will be the case. So yeah, let's see. Will the tariffs make a big difference? Will everyone back off and let America just bully them? Or are they going to start doing any kind of counteractions? And what is the long-term play here? And I think that's what I'm interested in is long-only investments. So I'm not looking to trade. I want to own something long-term because I think it has the ability to outpace Bitcoin, or I just want to own Bitcoin. And so number 3 is an experience I had recently becoming an Australian citizen. It's so interesting. So I think so. So my wife is Australian. I'm English originally. I grew up in the UK, moved to Singapore, met my now wife. We moved to London for a bit, and then moved to Australia in 2019. I would never, ever, ever have guessed 20 years ago that I'd be sitting in Australia with Aussie kids and an Aussie wife. Like, just forget it. Australia was, the home of Foster's, the Wallabies rugby team that was so good we could never beat them, apart from one time in the World Cup final. Johnny Wilkinson, shout out, that was amazing. And you didn't go there. Like, there were blokes in the pub with flip-flops in winter and Aussie accents. It's hilarious how one's life just evolves. And I'm so grateful for the experience and being here today. I moved here just as COVID kicked off, lived in Melbourne. We were in all the lockdowns there. That was a miserable experience. But to explain how I did it, so I basically, as I was married to an Aussie citizen, I was able to apply for what's called a partner visa. And the partner visa was for initially 2 years. With all the COVID lockdown stuff, they extended my partner visa for 2 years without having to reapply because the bureaucracy has essentially shut up shop and nothing was being processed. So at the end of 4 years, I was able to apply to become an Australian citizen. And that application process, well, first of all, the visa, all in, I think it's probably cost me about 10,000 Australian dollars to get to today, which is the initial partner visa payments, then the secondary payments, and then you got to pay, or I chose to pay a consultant to help me do the citizenship application, and I've just paid for a passport. It's been a long process, taking me over 5 years. Admittedly, on reaching 4 years, I moved from Melbourne up to northern New South Wales, and so I wasn't able to get the citizenship appointment that you have to do. So you make an application, you then have to study. And there's like a 20-question multiple choice. And I had to go to a government building, and I got interviewed by someone, or not interviewed, but like I had to do this test with someone sitting right in front of me, and I got 19 correct out of 20. And then you have to go to a citizenship ceremony where there's a speech by the local representative, and after which you get given your citizenship certificate, and then you can apply for a passport. And some of the things about this process that came up for me that were really challenging were, first of all, I like the phrase, watch what they do, not what they say. And COVID was just one of those crazy periods of time where it just ripped the Band-Aid off, right? And I think my summary of the experience is like, sometimes public health policy is more important than your individual choice. Something I just vehemently disagree with. And lo and behold, a couple of years later, the proponents of public health policy being more important have gone quiet, and the ramifications of trusting government, which actually turned out to be a kind of oligopoly of puppets for large pharmaceutical companies making extraordinary profits and socializing any losses. The vaccine industry has done an amazing job of actually getting legislation written in where, like, if their product is dodgy, it's not their fault. Follow the incentive, follow the money. None of it actually makes any sense. It's like, what's going on here? Without ranting on that too much, the government was very happy to, for your own good, lock you up. I went to a number of, they were called freedom rallies at the time, but they're essentially just like protests, right? You should have the ability to, like in the Constitution of Australia, the freedom to move and the freedom to speak. And they brought in all of these egregious, like, supposed legislation. It was never written into law, but you weren't supposed to travel more than 5 kilometers from your front door. You could only leave your house for essential travel. You had to wear masks. You had to do all this stuff. And by going to a protest, you were in breach of the chief health officer's health advice. And so they were arresting people. We saw, rubber bullets getting shot at the crowd. There was some amazing videos taken of like a huge full-on assault on the citizens of Melbourne on the Shrine of Remembrance. I mean, unbelievable use of police force, and Melbourne became a police state, like pretty simple. And like, it was a medical apartheid. People get so triggered by that phrase, but it was true. Unless you did what they wanted from a medical perspective, you had to abide by a different set of rules. And I don't make that statement to in any way bring in a racial discussion around apartheid, but more just like a statement of fact. It's like, if you didn't do what they wanted, then you experienced a lockout of certain parts of society. Okay, so it's very clear governments have the power to do that. Anyway, here I am. It's like applying to be a citizen of this same government that's treated people, in my opinion, so brutally and so inhumanely. Like, just what do you mean you don't have the choice to put something in your body? Like, are you absolutely insane? And so during the citizenship application process, there's all this, what I now look at is almost like propaganda. Okay, so you've got 20 questions, you've got to get them all right. Now, some of them are useful. They're talking about how the state government functions and how the federal level government functions. But then it's like, here in Australia, you have the right to marry someone of the same sex. But here in Australia, you don't have the right to have more than one wife. Here in Australia, we believe in the right to liberty and freedom of religion. I was like, those things don't make sense. Do you realize that? In one part of the world, it's totally normal to have multiple wives. But in another part of the world, it's not. What's correct? What is liberty? Surely the freedom of choice is the freedom to do what you want. And that was just such an interesting thing to come across. And this is my own fallacy in some senses. It's like, I like Australia. I like living here. I don't believe the modern government is doing as good a job as it could be, but I'm still going to go along with this game. And I'm just going to tick the boxes. And I know these are the correct answers, and through you jump. It's also interesting in terms of the experience I had at this kind of government center. And I talk about like government intervention and Then like people who are salaried government employees, and the obvious misalignment of incentive this creates. And this also applies, sadly, to anyone who's in the police force, in the fire department, in the health service, and in almost most importantly in the education system. Like if you're a teacher, you're getting paid by the government to tell kids what they want. Well, what if they tell them stuff you're not supposed to? Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense? And this is a really difficult thing to come to terms with in some ways. But if the government is able to print money and then hire more than 50% of the people in an economy, and if those 50% are paid by the people that if they don't vote for them, they don't get paid, oh, well, what a surprise that the government gets voted back in that, wants to hire more people. What is the right way to run a society? What is right? What is wrong? I mean, let's open that whole discussion up. I'm here to debate in some ways. I'm here to be wrong myself. I'm here to be proven wrong. But let's ask the right questions. And maybe we've been asking the wrong questions. I'll tie this all up with this kind of amusing experience of going to the citizenship ceremony. And my wife and son went along. And I had to stand up. And the meeting starts with, first of all, welcome to country. And it's this like extraordinary experience where obviously paying respects to the previous owners of the land of Australia seems like a nice thing, but it feels like a bit of a throwaway comment. And in a sense, like free markets are free markets. If you turn up with a gun and someone has a spear, well, you're out, mate. That's the rules of the game. And it's a very difficult situation here where like actions of generations 2 centuries before are being judged today of ancestors. That's not how this works, is it? Like you can't say because your forefather did something, you're in trouble. What are the rules today? Play within the rules of the game today. Anyway, that's probably a whole nother subject as to like what's right, what's wrong. And equally, the archaeology research I've done, which is admittedly not huge, but the idea that there's 60,000-year-old remains found in Australia of human beings. I mean, that's extraordinary, right? To think that, BC 2025 years ago, like it's a whole factor of 30, it's a 30x longer than that particular time frame. Like what the hell? Then the guy stands up and is like, hi guys, welcome. My boss is really sorry, the mayor of the area, they can't make it today. I'm their deputy. 3 or 4 other names of like senior politicians that should have been there. And then this lady gets up and she mentions the word diversity in her speech literally 9 times. It's like, why is diversity so important? Since when is diversity more important than ability? And who are the people that you're allowing into the country? What is good immigration? What's bad immigration? Again, open these questions up. I don't know. I then had to go up and, accept my citizenship certificate. And it was just a really fascinating experience. At one point, I got very emotional, almost crying, sitting there like, oh my God, this is happening. Like, why is this happening? Never expected to be there. And then you had to stand up and sing the national anthem. And the whole thing, then ends and we leave. I got a picture next to the Aussie flag. And lo and behold, there's King Charles. I'm like, King Charlie? What? And he's the head of state of Australia. And you're like, what the hell? This is something I'd love to learn more about, like the history of what is the Commonwealth and why did they structure the countries like this. And I found some interesting history recently, admittedly only in a fiction book, so I need to do some more digging. But about 100 years ago, turn of the 20th century, when Australia became a unified nation of states and the Northern Territory, there was discussion about creating a republic, and that didn't happen. And so it would be very interesting to wind the clock back and figure out why that was the case. The closer you get to Bitcoin, the more that you understand that money is something that evolves from the free market and is not the God-given gift of a government. And then you start looking at the incentives involved in what it means if someone can just print their own money versus someone who has to go and work for their money. And then it's like, hang on, this filters through to the education system, to the health system, to the security system, the police force, etc. It's like, what the hell is actually going on here? And therefore, in a sense, all government is controlled by the guy that prints the money, or is deeply influenced by whatever their preferences may or may not be, because they're the customer, right? They're actually the one paying for it. And that's why inflation is so nefarious, because it's like a stealth tax. It's like, yep, you're getting taxed on goods and services, you're getting taxed on your income, you're getting taxed at death, you're getting taxed on capital disposal, you're getting taxed at all these different points. And we're also stealing from you without you realizing, because we're printing money faster than you can earn it. What does this all mean? Anyway, why did I get Aussie passport? Because my wife is Aussie and I'm interested in the idea of owning multiple passports in different countries and therefore having more protection on the downside from a kind of plan B perspective. So I looked into this a fair bit. You can buy citizenship in Caribbean islands and things like this. If you're looking to get into a lower tax regime, you can go down this route as well. But for example, in the middle of the lockdowns, Aussie citizens had to ask permission from the Aussie government to leave the country. Whereas if you'd had a British passport or any other passport for that matter and turned up at the airport and popped that on the counter, they couldn't stop you. And if they tried, you could go to the embassy of that country and you could negotiate. So me having an Aussie passport doesn't exactly help for leaving Australia, but it might help in the future for something like getting into the United States. And I think it's just a good thing to have is other options. And so again, this is this thought of like, well, what is your wealth? In some ways, it's things like this. Have you figured out what happens if X, Y, Z, was to reoccur? And if there's something that I absolutely swore to myself when I was locked into my house in an inner city suburb of Melbourne was, I will never let this happen again. I didn't know where my water was coming from, didn't know where my food was coming from. I was overexposed to a capital asset that I couldn't sell. I couldn't walk out the front door. I was trapped. It was like, this can never happen again. And that was one of the major reasons to reallocate into what is digital wealth, into Bitcoin, and just give myself more buoyancy, as I've been calling it recently, more flexibility. And it's kind of part of what I touched on the last solo episode about frequency. You're removing these things that drag you or attach you to a place or keep you down. And I think that's really, really, really interesting. So yeah, look, shout out to you guys who have got this far in this episode. Thank you for joining. I'd love to know if you've had any experiences, moving countries, what that was like for you, why you did it, and any pitfalls that came up that, to be aware of. And if you have a third passport somewhere, where did you do that? And why did you do that? Because I think it's really interesting. But, thank you to Australia for this opportunity. Thank you to Lauren for meeting me and marrying me and bringing me here where I can enjoy the sunshine every day and run around on the beach. And the lifestyle here is, it's a really fantastic place to be a father and bring up a family. So I feel very blessed from that perspective. But I also am slowly but surely building towards this bigger position of, as my friend Ben Gunn points out, fuck you. What is your fuck you basis? Can you just pick up sticks and leave and not be fussed? Can you basically tell someone, fuck you, because you're coming from a position of capital safety, from a grounded place of happiness? And in his case, he's building this beast of a productivity business on top of, a physical piece of land. I've chosen to go more digital so far, but maybe physical land's part of that fuck you in the future. Having a place where you can say, look, come and get me. I'm not moving. But we'll cross that bridge when we get there. So thank you guys. Enjoy this wonderful day and reach out if there's any questions.